Chapter 60 of The Life of Christ by Frederic Farrar. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gillian, Hendrie. Chapter 60 Jesus before Pilate. Quote, Per procuratorem Pontium Pilatum supplicio effectus erat. He had been punished by the procurator Pontius Pilate. End quote. Tacitus, Annals, 1544. Suffered under Pontius Pilate. So in every creed of Christendom is the unhappy name of the Roman procurator handed down to eternal execration. Yet the object of introducing that name was not to point a moral, but to fix an epoch, and, in point of fact, of all the civil and ecclesiastical rulers before whom Jesus was brought to judgment, Pilate was the least guilty of malice and hatred, the most anxious, if not to spare his agony, at least to save his life. What manner of man was this in whose hands were placed, by power from above, the final destinies of the Saviour's life? Of his origin and of his antecedents before AD 26, when he became the 6th Procurator of Judea, but little is known. In rank he belonged to the knightly order, and he owed his appointment to the influence of Sejanus. His name Pontius seems to point to a Samnite extraction, his cognomen Pilatus to a warlike ancestry. His praenomen, if he had one, has not been preserved. In Judea he had acted with all the haughty violence and insolent cruelty of a typical Roman governor. Scarcely had he been well installed as procurator, when, allowing his soldiers to bring with them by night the silver eagles and other insignia of the legions from Caesarea to the Holy City, he excited a furious outburst of Jewish feeling against an act which they regarded as idolatrous profanation. For 5 days and nights, often lying prostrate on the bare ground, they surrounded and almost stormed his residence at Caesarea, with tumultuous and threatening entreaties, and could not be made to desist on the 6th, even by the peril of immediate and indiscriminate massacre at the hands of the soldiers whom he sent to surround them. He had then sullenly given way, and this foretaste of the undaunted and fanatical resolution of the people with whom he had to deal went far to embitter his whole administration with a sense of overpowering disgust. The outbreak of the Jews on a second occasion was perhaps less justifiable, but it might easily have been avoided if Pilate would have studied their character a little more considerately, and paid more respect to their dominant superstition. Jerusalem seems to have always suffered, as it does very grievously to this day, from a bad and deficient supply of water. To remedy this inconvenience, Pilate undertook to build an aqueduct, by which water could be brought from the pools of Solomon. Regarding this as a matter of public benefit, he applied to the purpose some of the money from the Corban, or sacred treasury, and the people rose in furious myriads to resent this secular approbation of their sacred fund. Stung by their insults and reproaches, Pilate disguised a number of his soldiers in Jewish costume, and sent them among the mob, with staves and daggers concealed under their garments, to punish the ringleaders. Upon the refusal of the Jews to separate quietly, a signal was given, and the soldiers carried out their instructions with such hearty goodwill that they wounded and beat to death not a few, both of the guilty and the innocent, and created so violent a tumult that many perished by being trodden to death under the feet of the terrified and surging mob. Thus, in a nation which produced the Sicarii, Pilate had given a fatal precedent of Sicarian conduct. The assassins had received from their procurator an example of the use of political assassination. A third seditious tumult must still more have embittered the disgust of the Roman governor for his subjects, by showing him how impossible it was to live among such a people, even in a conciliatory spirit, without outraging some of their sensitive prejudices. In the Herodian palace at Jerusalem, which he occupied during the festivals, he had hung some gilt shields dedicated to Tiberius. In the speech of Agrippa before the Emperor Gaius, as narrated by Philo, this act is attributed to wanton malice. But since, by the king's own admission, the shields were perfectly plain, and were merely decorated with a votive inscription, it is fair to suppose that the Jews had taken offence at what Pilate simply intended for a harmless private ornament, and one which, moreover, he could hardly remove without some danger of offending the gloomy and suspicious emperor, to whose honour they were dedicated. Since he would not give way, the chief men of the nation wrote a letter of complaint to Tiberius himself. It was a part of Tiberius's policy to keep the provinces contented, and his masculine intellect despised the obstinacy which would risk an insurrection rather than sacrifice a whim. He therefore reprimanded Pilate and ordered the obnoxious shields to be transferred from Jerusalem to the temple of Augustus at Caesarea. The latter incident is related by Philo only, and besides these 3 outbreaks, we hear in the Gospels of some wild tumult in which Pilate had mingled the blood of the Galileans with their sacrifices. He was finally expelled from his procuratorship in consequence of an accusation preferred against him by the Samaritans, who complained to Lucius Vitellius, the legate of Syria, that he had wantonly attacked, slain, and executed a number of them who had assembled on Mount Gerizim by the invitation of an impostor, possibly Simon Magus, who promised to show them the ark and sacred vessels of the temple, which he said had been concealed there by Moses. The conduct of Pilate seems on this occasion to have been needlessly prompt and violent, and although when he arrived at Rome he found that Tiberius was dead, yet even Gaius refused to reinstate him in his government, thinking it no doubt a bad sign that he should thus have become unpleasantly involved with the people of every single district in his narrow government. Sejanus had shown the most utter dislike against the Jews, and Pilate probably reflected his patron's antipathies. Such was Pontius Pilate, whom the pomps and perils of the great yearly festival had summoned from his usual residence at Caesarea Philippi to the capital of the nation, which he detested, and the headquarters of a fanaticism which he despised. At Jerusalem he occupied one of the 2 gorgeous palaces which had been erected there by the lavish architectural extravagance of the first Herod. It was situated in the upper city to the southwest of the Temple Hill, and, like the similar building at Caesarea, having passed from the use of the provincial king to that of the Roman emperor, was called Herod's Praetorium. It was one of those luxurious abodes, surpassing all description, which were in accordance with the tendencies of the age, and on which Josephus dwells with ecstasies of admiration. Between its colossal wings of white marble, called respectively Caesareum and Agrippium, in the usual spirit of Herodian flattery to the imperial house, was an open space commanding a noble view of Jerusalem, adorned with sculptured porticos and columns of many-coloured marble, paved with rich mosaics, varied with fountains and reservoirs, and green promenades which furnished a delightful asylum to flocks of doves. Externally it was a mass of lofty walls and towers and gleaming roofs, mingled in exquisite varieties of splendour. Within, its superb rooms, large enough to accommodate 100 guests, were adorned with gorgeous furniture and vessels of gold and silver. A magnificent abode for a mere Roman knight. And yet the furious fanaticism of the populace at Jerusalem made it a house so little desirable that neither Pilate nor his predecessors seem to have cared to enjoy its luxuries for more than a few weeks in the whole year. They were forced to be present in the Jewish capital during those crowded festivals which were always liable to be disturbed by some outburst of inflammable patriotism, and they soon discovered that even a gorgeous palace can furnish but a repulsive residence if it be built on the heaving lava of a volcano. In that kingly palace, such as in his days of freedom he had never trod, began in 3 distinct acts the 4th stage of that agitating scene which preceded the final agonies of Christ. It was unlike the idle inquisition of Annas, the extorted confession of Caiaphas, the illegal decision of the Sanhedrin, for here his judge was in his favour, and with all the strength of a feeble pride, and all the daring of a guilty cowardice, and all the pity of which a blood-stained nature was capable, did strive to deliver him. This last trial is full of passion and movement. It involves a 3-fold change of scene, a 3-fold accusation, a 3-fold acquittal by the Romans, a 3-fold rejection by the Jews, a 3-fold warning to Pilate, and a 3-fold effort on his part, made with ever-increasing energy and ever-deepening agitation, to baffle the accusers and to set the victim free. 1. It was probably about 7 in the morning that, thinking to overawe the procurator by their numbers and their dignity, The imposing procession of the Sanhedrists and priests, headed no doubt by Caiaphas himself, conducted Jesus with a cord round his neck. Matthew chapter 27, verse 2, Mark chapter 15, verse 1. From their hall of meeting, over the lofty bridge which spanned the valley of the Tyropaeon, in presence of all the city, with the bound hands of a sentenced criminal, a spectacle to angels and to men. Disturbed at this early hour, and probably prepared for some paschal disturbance more serious than usual, Pilate entered the hall of judgment, whither Jesus had been led, in company, as seems clear, with a certain number of his accusers, and of those most deeply interested in his case. But the great Jewish hierarchs, shrinking from ceremonial pollution, though not from moral guilt, afraid of leaven, though not afraid of innocent blood, refused to enter the Gentiles' hall, lest they should be polluted, and should consequently be unable that night to eat the Passover. In no good humour, but in haughty and half-necessary condescension to what he would regard as the despicable superstitions of an inferior race, Pilate goes out to them under the burning early sunlight of an eastern spring. One haughty glance takes in the pompous assemblage of priestly notables, and the turbulent mob of this singular people, equally distasteful to him as a Roman and as a ruler. And observing in that one glance the fierce passions of the accusers, as he had already noted the meek, ineffable grandeur of their victim, his question is sternly brief. What accusation bring ye against this man? The question took them by surprise, and showed them that they must be prepared for an unconcealed antagonism to all their purposes. Pilate evidently intended a judicial inquiry. They had expected only a license to kill, and to kill not by a Jewish method of execution, but by one which they regarded as more horrible and accursed. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. If he were not a malefactor, is their indefinite and surly answer, we would not have delivered him up to thee. But Pilate's Roman knowledge of law, his Roman instinct of justice, his Roman contempt for their murderous fanaticism, made him not choose to act upon a charge so entirely vague, nor give the sanction of his tribunal to their dark, disorderly decrees. He would not deign to be an executioner where he had not been a judge. Very well, he answered, with a superb contempt, take ye him and judge him according to your law. But now they are forced to the humiliating confession that, having been deprived of the right of the sword, they cannot inflict the death which alone would satisfy them, for indeed it stood written in the eternal councils that Christ was to die not by Jewish stoning or strangulation, but by that Roman form of execution which inspired the Jews with a nameless horror, even by crucifixion. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23, Numbers chapter 25, verse 4, 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 6. That he was to reign from his cross, to die by that most fearfully significant and typical of deaths, public, slow, conscious, accursed, agonizing, worse even than burning, the worst type of all possible deaths, and the worst result of that curse which he was to remove forever. Dropping therefore for the present the charge of blasphemy, which did not suit their purpose, compare Acts chapter 18, verse 14. They burst into a storm of invectives against him, in which are discernible the triple accusations: that he perverted the nation, that he forbade to give tribute, that he called himself a king. All three charges were flagrantly false, and the third all the more so because it included a grain of truth. But since they had not confronted Jesus with any proofs or witnesses, Pilate, in whose whole bearing and language is manifest the disgust, embittered by fear, with which the Jews inspired him, deigns to notice the third charge alone, and proceeds to discover whether the confession of the prisoner, always held desirable by Roman institutions, would enable him to take any cognizance of it. Leaving the impatient Sanhedrin and the raging crowd, he retired into the judgment hall. St. John alone preserves for us the memorable scene. Jesus, though not in soft clothing, though not a denizen of kings' houses, had been led up the noble flight of stairs, over the floors of agate and lazuli, under the gilded roofs, sealed with cedar and painted with vermilion, which adorned but one abandoned palace of a great king of the Jews. There, amid those voluptuous splendours, Pilate, already interested, already feeling in this prisoner before him some nobleness which touched his Roman nature, asked him in pitying wonder, "Art thou the King of the Jews?" Thou poor, worn, tear-stained outcast, in this hour of thy bitter need? O pale, lonely, friendless, wasted man, in thy poor peasant garments, with thy tied hands, and the foul traces of the insults of thine enemies on thy face and on thy robes, thou so unlike the fierce magnificent Herod, whom this multitude, which thirsts for thy blood, acknowledged as their sovereign, art thou the King of the Jews? There is a royalty which Pilate, and men like Pilate, cannot understand, a royalty of holiness, a supremacy of self-sacrifice. To say no would have been to belie the truth. To say yes would have been to mislead the questioner. "Sayest thou this of thyself?" he answered with gentle dignity, "or did others tell it thee of me?" "Am I a Jew?" is the disdainful answer. "Thy own nation and the chief priests delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done?" Done? Works of wonder, and mercy, and power, and innocence, and these alone. But Jesus reverts to the first question, now that he has prepared Pilate to understand the answer. Yes, he is a king, but not of this world, not from hence, not one for whom his servants would fight. "Thou art a king, then?" said Pilate to him in astonishment. Yes, but a king not in this region of falsities and shadows, but one born to bear witness unto the truth, and one whom all who were of the truth should hear. "Truth," said Pilate impatiently. "What is truth?" What had he, a busy, practical Roman governor, to do with such dim abstractions? What bearing had they on the question of life and death? What unpractical hallucination, what fairyland of dreaming fantasy was this? Yet, though he contemptuously put the discussion aside, he was touched and moved. A judicial mind, a forensic training, familiarity with human nature, which had given him some insight into the characters of men, showed him that Jesus was not only wholly innocent, but infinitely nobler and better than his raving, sanctimonious accusers. He wholly set aside the floating idea of an unearthly royalty. He saw in the prisoner before his tribunal an innocent and high-souled dreamer, nothing more. And so, leaving Jesus there, he went out again to the Jews, and pronounced his first emphatic and unhesitating acquittal. "I find in him no fault at all." 2. But this public, decided acquittal only kindled the fury of his enemies into yet fiercer flame. After all that they had hazarded, after all that they had inflicted, after the sleepless night of their plots, adjurations, insults, was their purpose to be foiled, after all, by the intervention of the very Gentiles on whom they had relied for its bitter consummation? Should this victim, whom they had thus clutched in their deathly grasp, be rescued from high priests and rulers by the contempt or the pity of an insolent heathen? It was too intolerable. Their voices rose in wilder tumult. He was a Mesite. He had upset the people with his teaching through the length and breadth of the land, beginning from Galilee, even as far as here. Amid these confused and passionate exclamations, the practised ear of Pilate caught the name of Galilee, and he understood that Galilee had been a chief scene of the ministry of Jesus. Luke chapter 13, verse 6. Eager for a chance of dismissing a business of which he was best pleased to be free, he proposed, by a masterstroke of astute policy, to get rid of an embarrassing prisoner, to save himself from a disagreeable decision, and to do an unexpected complaisance to the unfriendly Galilean tetrarch, who, as usual, had come to Jerusalem, nominally to keep the Passover, really to please his subjects and to enjoy the sensations and festivities offered at that season by the densely crowded capital. Accordingly, Pilate, secretly glad to wash his hands of a detestable responsibility, sent Jesus to Herod Antipas, Luke chapter 13, verse 7, who was probably occupying the old Asmonean palace, which had been the royal residence at Jerusalem until it had been surpassed by the more splendid one which the prodigal tyrant, his father, had built. And so, through the thronged and narrow streets, amid the jeering, raging multitudes, the weary sufferer was dragged once more. We have caught glimpses of this Herod Antipas before, and I do not know that all history, in its gallery of portraits, contains a much more despicable figure than this wretched, dissolute, Idumean Sadducee, this petty princeling, drowned in debauchery and blood. To him was addressed the sole purely contemptuous expression that Jesus is ever recorded to have used. Luke chapter 13, verse 32. Superstition and incredulity usually go together. Avowed atheists have yet believed in augury, and men who do not believe in God will believe in ghosts. Antipas was rejoiced beyond all things to see Jesus. He had long been wanting to see him because of the rumours he had heard. And this murderer of the prophets hoped that Jesus would, in compliment to royalty, amuse by some miracle his gaping curiosity. He harangued and questioned him in many words, but gained not so much as one syllable in reply. Our Lord confronted all his ribald questions with the majesty of silence. To such a man, who had changed scorn into a virtue, speech would clearly have been a profanation. Then all the savage vulgarity of the man came out through the thin veneer of a superficial cultivation. For the second time Jesus is derided this time as priest and prophet. Herod and his corrupt hybrid myrmidons set him at naught, treated him with the insolence of a studied contempt, mocking his innocence and his misery in a festal and shining robe. Luke chapter 18, verse 11. The empty and wicked prince sent him back to the procurator, to whom he now became half reconciled after a long-standing enmity. But he contented himself with these cruel insults. He resigned to the forum apprehensionis all further responsibility as to the issue of the trial. Though the chief priests and scribes stood about his throne, unanimously instigating him to a fresh and more heinous act of murder by their intense accusations. Compare Acts chapter 18, verse 28. He practically showed that he thought their accusations frivolous by treating them as a jest. It was the fifth trial of Jesus. It was his second public distinct acquittal. 3. And now, as he stood once more before the perplexed and wavering governor, began the sixth, the last, the most agitating and agonizing phase of this terrible inquisition. Now was the time for Pilate to have acted on a clear and right conviction, and saved himself forever from the guilt of innocent blood. He came out once more, and, seating himself on a stately bema, perhaps the golden throne of Archelaus, which was placed on the elevated pavement of many-coloured marble, John chapter 19, verse 13, summoned the priests, the Sanhedrists, and the people before him, and seriously told them that they had brought Jesus to his tribunal as a leader of sedition and turbulence, that after full and fair inquiry, he, their Roman governor, had found their prisoner absolutely guiltless of these charges, that he had then sent him to Herod, their native king, and that he also had come to the conclusion that Jesus had committed no crime which deserved the punishment of death. And now came the golden opportunity for him to vindicate the grandeur of his country's imperial justice, and, as he had pronounced him absolutely innocent, to set him absolutely free. But exactly at that point he wavered and temporized. The dread of another insurrection haunted him like a nightmare. He was willing to go halfway to please these dangerous sectaries, to justify them, as it were, in their accusation. He would chastise Jesus, scourge him publicly, as though to render his pretensions ridiculous, disgrace and ruin him, quote, make him seem vile in their eyes, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3, and then set him free. And this notion of setting him free suggested to him another resource of tortuous policy. Both he and the people almost simultaneously bethought themselves that it had always been a paschal boon to liberate at the feast some condemned prisoner. He offered, therefore, to make the acquittal of Jesus an act not of imperious justice, but of artificial grace. In making this suggestion, in thus flagrantly tampering with his innate sense of right, and resigning against his will the best prerogative of his authority, he was already acting in spite of a warning which he had received. The first warning consisted in the deep misgiving, the powerful presentiment which overcame him as he looked on his bowed and silent prisoner. But as though to strengthen him in his resolve to prevent an absolute failure of all justice, he now received a second solemn warning, and one which to an ordinary Roman, and a Roman who remembered Caesar's murder and Calpurnia's dream, might well have seemed divinely sinister. His own wife, Claudia Procula, ventured to send him a public message, even as he sat there on his tribunal, that in the morning hours, when dreams are true, Matthew chapter 27, verse 19, she had had a troubled and painful dream about that just man, and, bolder than her husband, she bade him beware how he molested him. Gladly, most gladly, would Pilate have yielded to his own presentiments, have gratified his pity and his justice, have obeyed the prohibition conveyed by this mysterious omen. Gladly even would he have yielded to the worse and baser instinct of asserting his power and thwarting these envious and hated fanatics, whom he knew to be ravening for innocent blood. That they, to many of whom sedition was as the breath of life, should be sincere in charging Jesus with sedition, was, as he well knew, absurd. Their utterly transparent hypocrisy in this matter only added to his undisguised contempt. If he could have dared to show his real instincts, he would have driven them from his tribunal with all the haughty insouciance of a Gallio. But Pilate was guilty, and guilt is cowardice, and cowardice is weakness. His own past cruelties, recoiling in kind on his own head, forced him now to crush the impulse of pity, and to add to his many cruelties another more heinous still. He knew that serious complaints hung over his head. Those Samaritans whom he had insulted and oppressed, those Jews whom he had stabbed promiscuously in the crowd by the hands of his disguised and secret emissaries, those Galileans whose blood he had mingled with their sacrifices, was not their blood crying for vengeance? Was not an embassy of complaint against him imminent even now? Would it not be dangerously precipitated if, in so dubious a matter as a charge of claiming a kingdom, he raised a tumult among a people in whose case it was the best interest of the Romans that they should hug their chains? Dare he stand the chance of stirring up a new and apparently terrible rebellion, rather than condescend to a simple concession, which was rapidly assuming the aspect of a politic and even necessary compromise? His tortuous policy recoiled on his own head, and rendered impossible his own wishes. The nemesis of his past wrongdoings was that he could no longer do right. Hounded on, Mark chapter 15, verse 11, by the priests and Sanhedrists, the people impetuously claimed the paschal boon of which he had reminded them. But in doing so, they unmasked still more decidedly the sinister nature of their hatred against their Redeemer. For while they were professing to rage against the asserted seditiousness of one who was wholly obedient and peaceful, they shouted for the liberation of a man whose notorious sedition had been also stained by brigandage and murder. Loathing the innocent, they loved the guilty, and claimed the procurator's grace on behalf not of Jesus of Nazareth, but of a man who, in the fearful irony of circumstance, was also called Jesus Barabbas, who not only was, what they falsely said of Christ, a leader of sedition, but also a robber and a murderer. It was fitting that they, who had preferred an abject Sadducee to their true priest, and an incestuous Idumean to their Lord and King, should deliberately prefer a murderer to their Messiah. It may be that Barabbas had been brought forth, and that thus Jesus the scowling murderer and Jesus the innocent Redeemer stood together on that high tribunal side by side. Matthew chapter 27, verse 21. The people, persuaded by their priests, clamoured for the liberation of the rebel and the robber. To him every hand was pointed, for him every voice was raised. For the holy, the harmless, the undefiled, for him whom 1,000 hosannas had greeted but 5 days before, no word of pity or of pleading found an utterance. He was despised and rejected of men. Deliberately putting the question to them, Pilate heard with scornful indignation their deliberate choice, and then, venting his bitter disdain and anger in taunts which did but irritate them more, without serving any good purpose, Quote, "What, then," he scornfully asked them, "do ye wish me to do with the King of the Jews?" Then first broke out the mad scream, "Crucify, crucify him!" In vain, again and again, in the pauses of the tumult, Pilate insisted, obstinately indeed, but with more and more feebleness of purpose, for none but a man more innocent than Pilate, even if he were a Roman governor, could have listened without quailing to the frantic ravings of an Oriental mob. See Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7. Why, what evil hath he done? I found no cause of death in him. I will chastise him and let him go. Such half-willed opposition was wholly unavailing. It only betrayed to the Jews the inward fears of their procurator, and practically made them masters of the situation. Again and again, with wilder and wilder vehemence, they rent the air with those hideous yells, Aire totum! Apolluson, Hemin, Baraban, Stauroson! Away with this man! Loose unto us Barabbas! Crucify! Crucify! For a moment Pilate seemed utterly to yield to the storm. He let Barabbas free. He delivered Jesus over to be scourged. The word used for the scourging, fragelusas, Matthew chapter 27, verse 26, implies that it was done not with rods, virgae, for Pilate had no lictors, but with what Horace calls the horrible flagellum, of which the Russian knout is the only modern representative. This scourging was the ordinary preliminary to crucifixion and other forms of capital punishment. Matthew chapter 27, verse 26. It was a punishment so truly horrible that the mind revolts at it, and it has long been abolished by that compassion of mankind which has been so greatly intensified, and in some degree even created, by the gradual comprehension of Christian truth. The unhappy sufferer was publicly stripped, was tied by the hands in a bent position to a pillar, and then, on the tense quivering nerves of the naked back, the blows were inflicted with leathern thongs, weighted with jabbed edges of bone and lead. Sometimes even the blows fell by accident, sometimes, with terrible barbarity, were purposely struck, on the face and eyes. It was a punishment so hideous that, under its lacerating agony, the victim generally fainted, often died. Still more frequently, a man was sent away to perish under the mortification and nervous exhaustion which ensued. And this awful cruelty on which we dare not dwell, this cruelty which makes the heart shudder and grow cold, was followed immediately by the third and bitterest derision, the derision of Christ as King. In civilized nations all is done that can be done to spare every needless suffering to a man condemned to death. But among the Romans, insult and derision were the customary preliminaries to the last agony. The et periuntibus addita ludibria, they were insulted even in the agonies of death, of Tacitus, might stand for their general practice. Such a custom furnished a specimen of that worst and lowest form of human wickedness which delights to inflict pain, which feels an inhuman pleasure in gloating over the agonies of another, even when he has done no wrong. The mere spectacle of agony is agreeable to the degraded soul. The low vile soldiery of the Praetorium, not Romans, who might have had more sense of the inborn dignity of the silent sufferer, but mostly the mere mercenary scum and dregs of the provinces, led him into their barrack-room, and there mocked, in their savage hatred, the king whom they had tortured. It added keenness to their enjoyment to have in their power one who was of Jewish birth, of innocent life, of noblest bearing. The opportunity broke so agreeably the coarse monotony of their life, that they summoned all of the cohort who were disengaged to witness their brutal sport. In sight of these hardened ruffians, they went through the whole heartless ceremony of a mock coronation, a mock investiture, a mock homage. Around the brows of Jesus, in wanton mimicry of the emperor's laurel, they twisted a thorny wreath of leaves. In his tied and trembling hands they placed a reed for sceptre, and from his torn and bleeding shoulders they stripped the white robe with which Herod had mocked him, which must now have been all soaked with blood, and flung on him an old scarlet paludament, some cast-off war-cloak with its purple laticlive from the Praetorian wardrobe. This, with feigned solemnity, they buckled over his right shoulder, with its glittering fibula. And then, each with his derisive homage of bended knee, each with his infamous spitting, each with the blow over the head from the reed sceptre which his bound hands could not hold. They kept passing before him with their mock salutation of "Hail, King of the Jews!" John chapter 19, verse 3. Even now, even yet, Pilate wished, hoped, even strove to save him. He might represent this frightful scourging, not as the preliminary to crucifixion, but as an inquiry by torture, which had failed to elicit any further confession. And as Jesus came forth, as he stood beside him with that martyr form on the beautiful mosaic of the tribunal, the spots of blood upon his green wreath of torture, the mark of blows and spitting on his countenance, the weariness of his deathful agony upon the sleepless eyes, the sagum of faded scarlet, darkened by the wheels of his lacerated back, and dropping, it may be, its stains of crimson upon the tessellated floor. Even then, even so, in that hour of his extremest humiliation, yet as he stood in the grandeur of his holy calm on that lofty tribunal above the yelling crowd, there shone all over him so godlike a preeminence, so divine a nobleness, that Pilate broke forth with that involuntary exclamation which has thrilled with emotion so many million hearts: "Behold the man!" But his appeal only woke a fierce outbreak of the scream, "Crucify! Crucify!" The mere sight of him, even in this his unspeakable shame and sorrow, seemed to add fresh fuel to their hate. In vain the heathen soldier appeals for humanity to the Jewish priest. No heart throbbed with responsive pity, no voice of compassion broke that monotonous yell of "Crucify!" the howling refrain of their wild liturgy of death. The Roman who had shed blood like water on the field of battle, in open massacre, in secret assassination, might well be supposed to have an icy and a stony heart. But yet icier and stonier was the heart of those scrupulous hypocrites and worldly priests. "Take ye him and crucify him," said Pilate in utter disgust, "for I find no fault in him." What an admission from a Roman judge! So far as I can see, he is wholly innocent. Yet if you must crucify him, take him and crucify. I cannot approve of, but I will readily connive at, your violation of the law. But even this wretched guilty subterfuge is not permitted him. Satan will have from his servants the full tale of their crimes, and the sign manual of their own willing assent at last. What the Jews want, what the Jews will have, is not tacit connivance, but absolute sanction. They see their power. They see that this blood-stained governor dares not hold out against them. They know that the Roman statecraft is tolerant of concessions to local superstition. Boldly, therefore, they fling to the winds all question of a political offence, and with all their hypocritical pretences calcined by the heat of their passion, they shout, "We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself a son of God." A son of God! The notion was far less strange and repulsive to a heathen than to a Jew, and this word, unheard before, startled Pilate with the third omen, which made him tremble at the crime into which he was being dragged by guilt and fear. Once more, leaving the yelling multitude without, he takes Jesus with him into the quiet judgment hall, and "jam pro sua conscientia Christianus," already in his inmost heart a Christian, as Tertullian so finely observes, asks him in awestruck accents, "Whence art thou?" Alas, it was too late to answer now. Pilate was too deeply committed to his gross cruelty and injustice. For him, Jesus had spoken enough already. For the wild beasts who raged without, he had no more to say. He did not answer. Then, almost angrily, Pilate broke out with the exclamation, "Dost thou not speak even to me? Dost thou not know that I have power to set thee free, and have power to crucify thee?" Power. How so? Was justice nothing then? Truth nothing? Innocence nothing? Conscience nothing? In the reality of things, Pilate had no such power. Even in the arbitrary sense of the tyrant, it was an idle boast. For at this very moment he was letting I dare not wait upon I would. And Jesus pitied the hopeless bewilderment of this man, whom guilt had changed from a ruler into a slave. Not taunting, not confuting him, nay, even extenuating rather than aggravating his sin, Jesus gently answered, quote, "Thou hast no power against me whatever, had it not been given thee from above. Therefore he that betrayed me to thee hath the greater sin." End quote. Thou art indeed committing a great crime, but Judas, Annas, Caiaphas, these priests and Jews, are more to blame than thou. Thus, with infinite dignity, and yet with infinite tenderness, did Jesus judge his judge. In the very depth of his inmost soul, Pilate felt the truth of the words, silently acknowledged the superiority of his bound and lacerated victim. All that remained in him of human and of noble, quote, felt how awful goodness is, and virtue, in her shape how lovely, felt and mourned his fall. End quote. All of his soul that was not eaten away by pride and cruelty thrilled back an unwanted echo to these few calm words of the Son of God. Jesus had condemned his sin, and so far from being offended, the judgment only deepened his awe of this mysterious being, whose utter impotence seemed grander and more awful than the loftiest power. From that time, Pilate was even yet more anxious to save him. With all his conscience in a tumult, for the third and last time, he mounted his tribunal and made one more desperate effort. He led Jesus forth, and looking at him, as he stood silent and in agony, but calm, on that shining Gabbatha, above the brutal agitations of the multitude, he said to those frantic rioters, as with a flash of genuine conviction, "Behold your king!" But to the Jews it sounded like shameful scorn to call that beaten, insulted sufferer their king. A darker stream mingled with the passions of the raging, swaying crowd. Among the shouts of "Crucify!" ominous threatenings began for the first time to be mingled. It was now 9 o'clock, and for nearly 3 hours had they been raging and waiting there. The name of Caesar began to be heard in wrathful murmurs. "Shall I crucify your king?" he had asked, venting the rage and soreness of his heart in taunts on them. "We have no king but Caesar," answered the Sadducees and priests, clinging to the winds every national impulse and every messianic hope. "If thou let this man go," shouted the mob again and again, "thou art not Caesar's friend. Every one who tries to make himself a king speaketh against Caesar." And at that dark, terrible name of Caesar, Pilate trembled. It was a name to conjure with. It mastered him. He thought of that terrible implement of tyranny, the accusation of lesa majestas, into which all other charges merged, which had made confiscation and torture so common, and had caused blood to flow like water in the streets of Rome. He thought of Tiberius, the aged, gloomy emperor, then hiding at Caprae, his ulcerous features, his poisonous suspicions, his sick infamies, his desperate revenge. At this very time he had been maddened into a yet more sanguinary and misanthropic ferocity by the detected falsity and treason of his only friend and minister, Sejanus, and it was to Sejanus himself that Pilate is said to have owed his position. There might be secret delators in that very mob. Panic-stricken, the unjust judge, in obedience to his own terrors, consciously betrayed the innocent victim to the anguish of death. He who had so often prostituted justice was now unable to achieve the one act of justice which he desired. He who had so often murdered pity was now forbidden to taste the sweetness of a pity for which he longed. He who had so often abused authority was now rendered impotent to exercise it for once on the side of right. Truly, for him, sin had become its own enriches, and his pleasant vices had been converted into the instrument of his punishment. Did the solemn and noble words of the law of the 12 Tables, quote, "Veni voces populi non sunt audiendi, quando od noxium crimine absolvi, od innocentum condemnari desiderant," the empty cries of the people must not be regarded when they call for the release of the guilty or the doom of the innocent, come across his memory with accents of reproach as he delivered Barabbas and condemned Jesus. It may have been so. At any rate, his conscience did not leave him at ease. At this or some early period of the trial, he went through the solemn farce of trying to absolve his conscience from the guilt. He sent for water. He washed his hands before the multitude. He said, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it." Did he think thus to wash away his guilt? He could wash his hands. Could he wash his heart? Might he not far more truly have said with the murderous king in the splendid tragedy, quote, "Can all old ocean's waters wash this blood clean from my hand? Nay, rather would this hand the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red." It may be that, as he thus murdered his conscience, such a thought flashed for a moment across his miserable mind, in the words of his native poet, quote, "Ah, minimum facilis, qui tristia crimina cidis, Flaminia tolli posse putatis aqua." All the elders shall wash their hands, and say, "Our hands have not shed this blood, neither have our eyes seen it." But if so, the thought was instantly drowned in a yell, the most awful, the most hideous, the most memorable that history records. Quote, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then Pilate finally gave way. The final ibis ad crucem was uttered with reluctant wrath. He delivered him unto them, that he might be crucified. And now mark, for one moment, the revenges of history. Has not his blood been on them and on their children? Has it not fallen most of all on those most nearly concerned in that deep tragedy? Before the dread sacrifice was consummated, Judas died in the horrors of a loathsome suicide. Caiaphas was deposed the year following. Herod died in infamy and exile, stripped of his procuratorship very shortly afterwards, on the very charges he had tried by a wicked concession to avoid. Pilate, wearied out with misfortunes, died in suicide and banishment, leaving behind him an execrated name. The house of Annas was destroyed a generation later by an infuriated mob, and his son was dragged through the streets and scourged and beaten to his place of murder. Some of those who shared in and witnessed the scenes of that day, and thousands of their children, also shared in and witnessed the long horrors of that siege of Jerusalem, which stands unparalleled in history for its unutterable fearfulness. Quote, "It seems," says Renan, "as though the whole race had appointed a rendezvous for extermination." They had shouted, "We have no king but Caesar," and they had no king but Caesar. And leaving only for a time the fantastic shadow of a local and contemptible royalty, Caesar after Caesar outraged and tyrannized and pillaged and oppressed them, till at last they rose in wild revolt against the Caesar whom they had claimed. And a Caesar slaked in the blood of its best defenders, the red ashes of their burnt and desecrated temple. They had forced the Romans to crucify their Christ, and though they regarded this punishment with especial horror, they and their children were themselves crucified in myriads by the Romans outside their own walls, till room was wanting and wood failed, and the soldiers had to ransack a fertile inventiveness of cruelty for fresh methods of inflicting this insulting form of death. They had given 30 pieces of silver for their Saviour's blood, and they were themselves sold in thousands for yet smaller sums. They had chosen Barabbas in preference to their Messiah, and for them there had been no Messiah more, while a murderer's dagger swayed the last counsels of their dying nationality. They had accepted the guilt of blood, and the last pages of their history were glued together with the rivers of their blood, and that blood continued to be shed in wanton cruelties from age to age. They who will may see in incidents like these the mere unmeaning chances of history. But there is in history nothing unmeaning to one who regards it as the voice of God speaking among the destinies of men. And whether a man sees any significance or not in events like these, he must be blind indeed who does not see that when the murder of Christ was consummated, the axe was laid at the root of the barren tree of Jewish nationality. Since that day, Jerusalem and its environs, with their ever-extending miles of gravestones and ever-lengthening pavement of tombs and sepulchres, have become little more than one vast cemetery, an akeldama, a field of blood, a potter's field to bury strangers in. Like the mark of Cain upon the forehead of their race, the guilt of that blood has seemed to cling to them, as it ever must, until the same blood effaceth it. For by God's mercy that blood was shed for them also who made it flow. The voice which they strove to quench in death was uplifted in its last prayer for pity on his murderers. May that blood be efficacious. May that prayer be heard. End of chapter 60. Chapter 61 of The Life of Christ by Frederic Farrar. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gillian Hendrie. Chapter 61. The Crucifixion. Quote, Dum crucis inimicos, vocabis et amicos, O Jesu, Filii Dei, sis oro memor mei. When thou shalt call the friends of the cross and its enemies, O Jesu, Son of God, I pray thee remember me. End quote. Thomas of Celano, De Cruce Domini. Imiles expedi crucem. Go, soldier, get ready the cross. In some such formula of terrible import, Pilate must have given his final order. The execution followed immediately upon the judgment. The time required for the necessary preparation would not be very long, and during this brief pause, the soldiers, whose duty it was to see that the sentence was carried out, stripped Jesus of the scarlet war-cloak, now dyed with the yet deeper stains of blood, and clad him again in his own garments. When the cross had been prepared, they laid it, or possibly only one of the beams of it, upon his shoulders, and led him to the place of punishment. The nearness of the great feast, the myriads who were present in Jerusalem, made it desirable to seize the opportunity for striking terror into all Jewish malefactors. 2 were therefore selected for execution at the same time with Jesus, 2 brigands and rebels of the lowest stamp. Their crosses were laid upon them. A maniple of soldiers in full armour were marshalled under the command of their centurion, and amidst thousands of spectators, coldly inquisitive or furiously hostile, the procession started on its way. The cross was not, and could not have been, the massive and lofty structure with which such myriads of pictures have made us familiar. Crucifixion was among the Romans a very common punishment, and it is clear that they would not waste any trouble in constructing the instrument of shame and torture. It would undoubtedly be made of the very commonest wood that came to hand, perhaps olive or sycamore, and knocked together in the very rudest fashion. Still, to support the body of a man, a cross would require to be of a certain size and weight, and to one enfeebled by the horrible severity of the previous scourging, the carrying of such a burden would be an additional misery. Compare Genesis chapter 22, verse 6, Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. But Jesus was enfeebled not only by this cruelty, but by previous days of violent struggle and agitation, by an evening of deep and overwhelming emotion, by a night of sleepless anxiety and suffering, by the mental agony of the garden, by 3 trials and 3 sentences of death before the Jews, by the long and exhausting scenes in the Praetorium, by the examination before Herod, and by the brutal and painful derisions which he had undergone first at the hands of the Sanhedrin and their servants, then from Herod's bodyguard, and lastly from the Roman cohort. All these superadded to the sickening lacerations of the scourging, and utterly broken down his physical strength. His tottering footsteps, if not his actual falls under that fearful load, made it evident that he lacked the physical strength to carry it from the Praetorium to Golgotha. Even if they did not pity his feebleness, the Roman soldiers would naturally object to the consequent hindrance and delay. But they found an easy method to solve the difficulty. They had not proceeded farther than the city gate when they met a man coming from the country, who was known to the early Christians as Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. And perhaps on some hint from the accompanying Jews that Simon sympathized with the teaching of the sufferer, they impressed him without the least scruple in their odious service. The miserable procession resumed its course, and though the apocryphal traditions of the Romish Church narrate many incidents of the Via Dolorosa, only one such incident is recorded in the Gospel history. St. Luke tells us that among the vast multitude of people who followed Jesus were many women. From the men in that moving crowd, he does not appear to have received one word of pity or of sympathy. Some there must surely have been who had seen his miracles, who had heard his words. some of those who had been almost, if not utterly, convinced of his messiahship, as they hung upon his lips while he uttered his great discourses in the temple, some of the eager crowd who had accompanied him from Bethany 5 days before, with shouted hosannas and waving palms. Yet if so, a faithless timidity or a deep misgiving, perhaps even a boundless sorrow, kept them dumb. But these women, more quick to pity, less susceptible to controlling influences, could not and would not conceal the grief and amazement with which this spectacle filled them. They beat upon their breasts and rent the air with their lamentations, till Jesus himself hushed their shrill cries with words of solemn warning. Turning to them, which he could not have done had he still been staggering under the burden of his cross, he said to them, quote, "Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but for yourselves weep, and for your children. For lo, days are coming, in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs which bare not, and the breasts which gave not suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things in the green tree, what shall be done in the dry?" End quote. Theirs was but an emotional outburst of womanly tenderness, which they could not repress as they saw the great prophet of mankind in his hour of shame and weakness, with the herald proclaiming before him the crimes with which he was charged, and the Roman soldiers carrying the title of derision, and Simon bending under the weight of the wood to which he was to be nailed. But he warned them that, if this were all which they saw in the passing spectacle, far bitterer causes of woe awaited them, and their children, and their race. Many of them, and the majority of their children, would live to see such rivers of bloodshed, such complications of agony, as the world had never known before. Days which would seem to overpass the capacities of human suffering, and would make men seek to hide themselves, if it might be, under the very roots of the hill on which their city stood. Hosea chapter 9 verses 12 to 16, and chapter 10 verse 8, Isaiah chapter 2 verse 10, Revelations chapter 6 verse 16. The fig tree of their nation's life was still green. If such deeds of darkness were possible now, what should be done when that tree was withered and blasted and ready for the burning? If, in the days of hope and decency, they could execrate their blameless deliverer, what would happen in the days of blasphemy and madness and despair? If, under the full light of day, priests and scribes could crucify the innocent, what would be done in the midnight orgies and blood-stained bacchanalia of zealots and murderers? This was a day of crime. That would be a day when crime had become her own avenging fury. The solemn warning, the last sermon of Christ on earth, was meant primarily for those who heard it, but, like all the words of Christ, it has deeper and wider meaning for all mankind. Those words warn every child of man that the day of careless pleasure and blasphemous disbelief will be followed by the crack of doom. They warn each human being who lives in pleasure on the earth, and eats and drinks, and is drunken, that though the patience of God waits, and his silence is unbroken, yet the days shall come when he shall speak in thunder, and his wrath shall burn like fire. And so with this sole sad episode they came to the fatal place called Golgotha, or in its Latin form, Calvary, that is, a skull. Why it was so called is not known. It may conceivably have been a well-known place of execution, or possibly the name may imply a bare, rounded, scalp-like elevation. It is constantly called the hill of Golgotha or of Calvary, but the Gospels merely call it a place and not a hill. Matthew chapter 27 verse 33, Mark chapter 15 verse 22. Respecting its site, volumes have been written, but nothing is known. The data for anything approaching to certainty are wholly wanting, and in all probability the actual spot lies buried and obliterated under the mountainous rubbish heaps of the 10 times taken city. The rugged and precipitous mountain represented in sacred pictures is as purely imaginary as the skull of Adam, which is often painted lying at the foot of the cross, or as any other of the myriads of legends which have gathered round this most stupendous and moving scene in the world's history. All that we know of Golgotha, all that we shall ever know, all that God willed to be known, is that it was without the city gate. The religion of Christ is spiritual. It needs no relic. It is independent of holy places. It says to each of its children, not lo here and lo there, but the kingdom of God is within you. Utterly brutal and revolting as was the punishment of crucifixion, which has now for 1500 years been abolished by the common pity and abhorrence of mankind. There was one custom in Judea, and one custom occasionally practised by the Romans, which reveals some touch of passing humanity. The latter consisted in giving to the sufferer a blow under the armpit, which, without causing death, yet hastened its approach. Of this I need not speak, because, for whatever reason, it was not practised on this occasion. The former, which seems to have been due to the milder nature of Judaism, and which was derived from a happy piece of rabbinic exegesis on Proverbs chapter 31, verse 6, consisted in giving to the condemned, immediately before his execution, a draught of wine medicated with some powerful opiate. It had been the custom of wealthy ladies in Jerusalem to provide this stupefying potion at their own expense, and they did so quite irrespectively of their sympathy for any individual criminal. It was probably taken freely by the two malefactors, but when they offered it to Jesus, he would not take it. The refusal was an act of sublimest heroism. The effect of the draught was to dull the nerves, to cloud the intellect, to provide an anaesthetic against some part at least of the lingering agonies of that dreadful death. But he, whom some modern sceptics have been base enough to accuse of feminine feebleness and cowardly despair, preferred rather to look death in the face, to meet the King of Terrors without striving to deaden the force of one agonizing anticipation, or to still the throbbing of one lacerated nerve. The 3 crosses were laid on the ground, that of Jesus, which was doubtless taller than the other 2, being placed in bitter scorn in the midst. Perhaps the crossbeam was now nailed to the upright, and certainly the title, which had either been borne by Jesus, fastened round his neck, or carried by one of the soldiers in front of him, was now nailed to the summit of his cross. Then he was stripped of his clothes, and then followed the most awful moment of all. He was laid down upon the implement of torture. His arms were stretched along the crossbeams, and at the centre of the open palms the point of a huge iron nail was placed, which, by the blow of a mallet, was driven home into the wood. Then, through either foot separately, or possibly through both together as they were placed one over the other, another huge nail tore its way through the quivering flesh. Whether the sufferer was also bound to the cross we do not know, but to prevent the hands and feet being torn away by the weight of the body, which could not rest upon nothing but 4 great wounds, there was about the centre of the cross a wooden projection strong enough to support at least in part a human body, which soon became a weight of agony. It was probably at this moment of inconceivable horror that the voice of the Son of Man was heard uplifted, not in a cry of natural agony at that fearful torture, but calmly praying in divine compassion for his brutal and pitiless murderers, aye, and for all who in their sinful ignorance crucify him afresh forever. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And then the accursed tree, with its living human burden hanging upon it in helpless agony, and suffering fresh tortures as every movement irritated the fresh rents in hands and feet, was slowly heaved up by strong arms, and the end of it fixed firmly in a hole dug deep in the ground for that purpose. The feet were but a little raised above the earth. The victim was in full reach of every hand that might choose to strike, in close proximity to every gesture of insult and hatred. He might hang for hours to be abused, insulted, even tortured by the ever-moving multitude, who, with that desire to see what is horrible which always characterizes the coarsest hearts, had thronged to gaze upon a sight which should rather have made them weep tears of blood. And there, in tortures which grew ever more insupportable, ever more maddening as time flowed on, the unhappy victims might linger in pain so cruelly intolerable that often they were driven to entreat and implore the spectators or the executioners, for dear pity's sake, to put an end to anguish too awful for man to bear, conscious to the last, and often with tears of abject misery, beseeching from their enemies the priceless boon of death. For indeed, a death by crucifixion seems to include all that pain and death can have of horrible and ghastly: dizziness, cramp, thirst, starvation, sleeplessness, traumatic fever, tetanus, publicity of shame, long continuance of torment, horror of anticipation, mortification of untended wounds, all intensified just up to the point at which they can be endured at all, but all stopping just short of the point which would give to the sufferer the relief of unconsciousness. The unnatural position made every movement painful. The lacerated veins and crushed tendons throbbed with incessant anguish. The wounds, inflamed by exposure, gradually gangrened. The arteries, especially of the head, became swollen and oppressed with surcharged blood. And while each variety of misery went on gradually increasing, there was added to them the intolerable pang of a burning and raging thirst. And all these physical complications caused an internal excitement and anxiety, which made the prospect of death itself, of death, the awful unknown enemy, at whose approach man usually shudders most, bear the aspect of a delicious and exquisite release. Such was the death to which Christ was doomed, and though for him it was happily shortened by all that he had previously endured, yet he hung from soon after noon until nearly sunset, before, he gave up his soul to death. When the cross was uplifted, the leading Jews, for the first time, prominently noticed the deadly insult in which Pilate had vented his indignation. Before, in their blind rage, they had imagined that the manner of his crucifixion was an insult aimed at Jesus, but now that they saw him hanging between the two robbers, or a cross yet loftier, it suddenly flashed upon them that it was a public scorn inflicted upon them. For on the white wooden tablet smeared with gypsum, which was to be seen so conspicuously over the head of Jesus on the cross, ran in black letters an inscription in the 3 civilized languages of the ancient world, the 3 languages of which one at least was certain to be known by every single man in that assembled multitude, in the official Latin, in the current Greek, in the vernacular Aramaic, informing all that this man who was thus enduring a shameful servile death, this man thus crucified between 2 sicari in the sight of the world, Mark chapter 15 verse 28, Isaiah chapter 53 verse 12, was the King of the Jews. To him who was crucified, the poor malice seemed to have in it nothing of derision. Even on his cross he reigned. Even there he seemed divinely elevated above the priests who had brought about his death, and the coarse, idle, vulgar multitude who had flocked to feed their greedy eyes upon his sufferings. The malice was quite impotent against one whose spiritual and moral nobleness struck awe into dying malefactors and heathen executioners, even in the lowest abyss of his physical degradation. With the passionate ill humour of the Roman governor, there probably blended a vein of seriousness. While he was delighted to revenge himself on his detested subjects by an act of public insolence, he probably meant, or half meant, to imply that this was, in one sense, the King of the Jews, the greatest, the noblest, the truest of his race, whom therefore his race had crucified. The king was not unworthy of his kingdom, but the kingdom of the king. There was something loftier even than royalty in the glazing eyes which never ceased to look with sorrow on the city of righteousness, which had now become a city of murderers. The Jews felt the intensity of the scorn with which Pilate had treated them. It so completely poisoned their hour of triumph that they sent their chief priests in deputation begging the governor to alter the obnoxious title. "Write not," they said, "the King of the Jews, but that he said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" But Pilate's courage, which had oozed away so rapidly at the name of Caesar, had now revived. He was glad in any and every way to browbeat and thwart the men whose seditious clamour had forced him in the morning to act against his will. Few men had the power of giving expression to a sovereign contempt more effectually than the Romans. Without deigning any justification of what he had done, Pilate summarily dismissed these solemn hierarchs with the curt and contemptuous reply, "What I have written, I have written." In order to prevent the possibility of any rescue, even at the last moment, since instances had been known of men taken from the cross and restored to life, a quaternion of soldiers with their centurion were left on the ground to guard the cross. The clothes of the victims always fell as perquisites to the men who had to perform so weary and disagreeable an office. Little dreaming how exactly they were fulfilling the mystic intimations of olden Jewish prophecy, they proceeded, therefore, to divide between them the garments of Jesus. The tallit they tore into 4 parts, probably ripping it down the seams. But the ketonet, or undergarment, was formed of one continuous woven texture, and to tear would have been to spoil it. They therefore contented themselves with letting it become the property of any one of the four to whom it should fall by lot. When this had been decided, they sat down and watched him till the end, beguiling the weary, lingering hours by eating and drinking, and gibing, and playing dice. It was a scene of tumult. The great body of the people seemed to have stood silently at gaze, but some few of them, as they passed by the cross, perhaps some of the many false witnesses and other conspirators of the previous night, mocked at Jesus with insulting noises and furious taunts, especially bidding him come down from the cross and save himself, since he could destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. And the chief priests and scribes and elders, less awestruck, less compassionate than the mass of the people, were not ashamed to disgrace their grey-haired dignity and lofty reputation by adding their heartless reproaches to those of the evil few. Unrestrained by the noble patience of the sufferer, unsated by the accomplishment of their wicked vengeance, unmoved by the sight of helpless anguish and the look of eyes that began to glaze in death, they congratulated one another, Mark chapter 15, verse 31, under his cross, with scornful insolence. Quote, "He saved others, himself he cannot save. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe." No wonder, then, that the ignorant soldiers took their share of mockery with these shameless and unvenerable hierarchs. No wonder that, at their midday meal, they pledged in mock hilarity the dying man, cruelly holding up towards his burning lips their cups of sour wine, and echoing the Jewish taunts against the weakness of the king whose throne was a cross, whose crown was thorns. Nay, even the poor wretches who were crucified with him caught the hideous infection. Comrades, perhaps, of the respited Barabbas, heirs of the rebellious fury of a Judas the Gaulonite, trained to recognize no Messiah but a Messiah of the sword. They reproachfully bade him, if his claims were true, to save himself and them. So all the voices about him rang with blasphemy and spite, and in that long, slow agony his dying ear caught no accent of gratitude, of pity, or of love. Baseness, falsehood, savagery, stupidity, such were the characteristics of the world which thrust itself into hideous prominence before the Saviour's last consciousness, such the muddy and miserable stream that rolled under the cross before his dying eyes. But amid this chorus of infamy, Jesus spoke not. He could have spoken. The pains of crucifixion did not confuse the intellect or paralyze the powers of speech. We read of crucified men who, for hours together upon the cross, vented their sorrow, their rage, or their despair in the manner that best accorded with their character, or some who raved and cursed and spat at their enemies, of others who protested to the last against the iniquity of their sentence, of others who implored compassion with abject entreaties, of one even who, from the cross, as from a tribunal, harangued the multitude of his countrymen and upbraided them with their wickedness and vice. But except to bless and to encourage, and to add to the happiness and hope of others, Jesus spoke not. So far as the malice of the passers-by, and of priests and Sanhedrists, and soldiers, and of these poor robbers who suffered with him, was concerned, as before during the trial, so now upon the cross, he maintained unbroken his kingly silence. But that silence, joined to his patient majesty, and the divine holiness and innocence which radiated from him like a halo, was more eloquent than any words. It told earliest on one of the crucified robbers. At first this bonus latro of the apocryphal Gospels seems to have faintly joined in the reproaches uttered by his fellow sinner, but when those reproaches merged into deeper blasphemy, he spoke out his inmost thought. It is probable that he had met Jesus before and heard him, and perhaps been one of the thousands who had seen his miracles. There is indeed no authority for the legend which assigns to him the name of Dismas, or for the beautiful story of his having saved the life of the Virgin and her child during their flight into Egypt. But on the plains of Gennesaret, perhaps from some robber's cave in the wild ravines of the Valley of the Doves, he may well have approached his presence. He may well have been one of those publicans and sinners who drew near to him for to hear him. And the words of Jesus had found some room in the good ground of his heart. They had not all fallen upon stony places. Even at this hour of shame and death, when he was suffering the just consequence of his past evil deeds, faith triumphed. As a flame sometimes leaps up among dying embers, so amid the white ashes of a sinful life which lay so thick upon his heart, the flame of love towards his God and his Saviour was not quite quenched. Under the hellish outcries which had broken loose around the cross of Jesus, there had lain a deep misgiving. Half of them seemed to have been instigated by doubt and fear. Even in the self-congratulations of the priests, we catch an undertone of dread. Suppose that even now some imposing miracle should be wrought. Suppose that even now that martyr form should burst indeed into messianic splendour, and the king, who seemed to be in the slow misery of death, should suddenly, with a great voice, summon his legions of angels, and springing from his cross upon the rolling clouds of heaven, come in flaming fire to take vengeance upon his enemies. And the air seemed to be full of signs. There was a gloom of gathering darkness in the sky, a thrill of tremor in the solid earth, a haunting presence as of ghostly visitants who chilled the heart and hovered in awful witness above that scene. The dying robber had joined at first in the half-taunting, half-despairing appeal to a defeat and weakness which contradicted all that he had hoped. But now this defeat seemed to be greater than victory, and this weakness more irresistible than strength. As he looked, the faith in his heart dawned more and more into the perfect day. He had long ceased to utter any reproachful words. He now rebuked his comrades' blasphemies. Ought not the suffering innocence of him who hung between them to shame into silence their just punishment and flagrant guilt? And so, turning his head to Jesus, he uttered the intense appeal, "O Jesus, remember me when thou comest in thy kingdom." Then he, who had been mute amid invectives, spake at once in surpassing answer to that humble prayer, "Verily, I say to thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise." Though none spoke to comfort Jesus, though deep grief and terror and amazement kept them dumb, yet there were hearts amid the crowd that beat in sympathy with the awful sufferer. At a distance stood a number of women looking on, and perhaps even at that dread hour expecting his immediate deliverance. Many of these were women who had ministered to him in Galilee, and had come from thence in the great band of Galilean pilgrims. Conspicuous among this heart-stricken group were his mother Mary, Mary of Magdala, Mary the wife of Clopas, mother of James and Joseph, and Salome the wife of Zebedee. Some of them, as the hours advanced, stole nearer and nearer to the cross, and at length the filming eye of the Saviour fell on his own mother Mary, as, with the sword piercing through and through her heart, she stood with the disciple whom he loved. His mother does not seem to have been much with him during his ministry. It may be that the duties and cares of a humble home rendered it impossible. At any rate, the only occasions on which we hear of her are occasions when she is with his brethren, and is joined with them in endeavouring to influence, apart from his own purposes and authority, his messianic course. But although at the very beginning of his ministry he had gently shown her that the earthly and filial relation was now to be transcended by one far more lofty and divine, and though this end of all her high hopes must have tried her faith with an overwhelming and unspeakable sorrow, yet she was true to him in this supreme hour of his humiliation, and would have done for him all that a mother's sympathy and love could do. Nor had he for a moment forgotten her who had bent over his infant slumbers, and with whom he had shared those 30 years in the cottage at Nazareth. Tenderly and sadly he thought of the future that awaited her during the remainder of her life on earth, troubled as they must be by the tumults and persecutions of a struggling and nascent faith. After his resurrection, her lot was wholly cast among his apostles, and the apostle whom he loved the most, the apostle who was nearest to him in heart and life, seemed the fittest to take care of her. To him, therefore, to John, whom he had loved more than his brethren, to John whose head had leaned upon his breast at the Last Supper, he consigned her as a sacred charge. "Woman," he said to her, in fewest words, but in words which breathed the uttermost spirit of tenderness, "behold thy son," and then to St. John, "behold thy mother." He could make no gesture with those pierced hands, but he could bend his head. They listened in speechless emotion, but from that hour, perhaps from that very moment, leading her away from a spectacle which did but torture her soul with unavailing agony. That disciple took her to his own home. John chapter 19, verse 27. It was now noon, and at the Holy City the sunshine should have been burning over that scene of horror with a power such as it has in the full depth of an English summer-time. But instead of this, the face of the heavens was black, and the noonday sun was turned into darkness, on this great and terrible day of the Lord. It could have been no darkness of any natural eclipse, for the Paschal moon was at the full, but it was one of those signs from heaven, for which, during the ministry of Jesus, the Pharisees had so often clamoured in vain. The early fathers appealed to pagan authorities, the historian Phallus, the chronicler Phlegon, for such a darkness. But we have no means of testing the accuracy of these references, and it is quite possible that the darkness was a local gloom which hung densely over the guilty city and its immediate neighbourhood. But whatever it was, it clearly filled the minds of all who beheld it with yet deeper misgiving. The taunts and jeers of the Jewish priests and the heathen soldiers were evidently confined to the earlier hours of the crucifixion. Its later stages seem to have thrilled alike the guilty and the innocent with emotions of dread and horror. Of the incidents of those last 3 hours we are told nothing, and that awful obscuration of the noonday sun may well have overawed every heart into an inaction respecting which there was nothing to relate. What Jesus suffered then for us men and our salvation we cannot know, for during those 3 hours he hung upon his cross in silence and darkness, or if he spoke, there were none there to record his words. But towards the close of that time his anguish culminated, and, emptied to the very uttermost of that glory which he had since the world began, drinking to the very deepest dregs the cup of humiliation and bitterness, enduring not only to have taken upon him the form of a servant, but also to suffer the last infamy which human hatred could impose on servile helplessness, he uttered that mysterious cry, of which the full significance will never be fathomed by man. Quote, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? In those words, quoting the psalm in which the early fathers rightly saw a far-off prophecy of the whole passion of Christ, he borrowed from David's utter agony the expression of his own. In that hour he was alone, sinking from depth to depth of unfathomable suffering, until, at the close approach of a death which, because he was God, and yet had been made man, was more awful to him than it could ever be to any of the sons of men, it seemed as if even his divine humanity could endure no more. Doubtless the voice of the sufferer, though unuttered loudly in that paroxysm of an emotion which in another would almost have touched the verge of despair, was yet rendered more uncertain and indistinct from the condition of exhaustion in which he hung. And so, amid the darkness and confused noise and dull footsteps of the moving multitude, there were some who did not hear what he had said. They had caught only the first syllable, and said to one another that he had called on the name of Elijah. The readiness with which they seized this false impression is another proof of the wild state of excitement and terror, the involuntary dread of something great and unforeseen and terrible, to which they had been reduced from their former savage insolence. For Elijah, the great prophet of the Old Covenant, was inextricably mingled with all the Jewish expectations of a Messiah, and these expectations were full of wrath. The coming of Elijah would be the coming of a day of fire, in which the sun should be turned into blackness and the moon into blood, and the powers of heaven should be shaken. Already the noonday sun was shrouded in unnatural eclipse. Might not some awful form at any moment rend the heavens and come down, touch the mountains, and they should smoke? The vague anticipation of conscious guilt was unfulfilled. Not such as yet was to be the method of God's workings. His messages to man for many ages more were not to be in the thunder and earthquake, not in rushing wind or roaring flame, but in the still small voice, speaking always amid the apparent silences of time in whispers intelligible to man's heart, but in which there is neither speech nor language, though the voice is heard. But now the end was very rapidly approaching, and Jesus, who had been hanging for nearly 6 hours upon the cross, was suffering from that torment of thirst which is most difficult of all for the human frame to bear. perhaps the most unmitigated of the many separate sources of anguish which were combined in this worst form of death. No doubt this burning thirst was aggravated by seeing the Roman soldiers drinking so near the cross, and happily for mankind, Jesus had never sanctioned the unnatural affectation of stoic impassibility, and so he uttered the one sole word of physical suffering which had been wrung from him by all the hours in which he had endured the extreme of all that man can inflict. He cried aloud, "I thirst." It is probable that, a few hours before, the cry would have only provoked a roar of frantic mockery, but now the lookers-on were reduced by awe to a readier humanity. Near the cross there lay on the ground the large earthen vessel containing the posca, which was the ordinary drink of the Roman soldiers. The mouth of it was filled with a piece of sponge, which served as a cork. Instantly someone, we know not whether he was friend or enemy, or merely one who was there out of idle curiosity, took out the sponge and dipped it in the posca, Mark chapter 15, verse 36, to give it to Jesus. But low as was the elevation of the cross, the head of the sufferer, as it rested on the horizontal beam of the accursed tree, was just beyond the man's reach, and therefore he put the sponge at the end of a stalk of hyssop, about a foot long, and held it up to the parched and dying lips. Mark chapter 27, verse 48, John chapter 19, verse 29. Even this simple act of pity, which Jesus did not refuse, seemed to jar upon the condition of nervous excitement with which some of the multitude were looking on. "Let be," they said to the man. "Let us see whether Elias is coming to save him." The man did not desist from his act of mercy, but when it was done, he too seems to have echoed those uneasy words. Mark chapter 15, verse 36. But Elias came not, nor human comforter, nor angel deliverer. It was the will of God, it was the will of the Son of God, that he should be perfected through sufferings. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, chapter 2, verse 10, Philippians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. That for the eternal example of all his children, as long as the world should last, he should endure unto the end. And now the end was come. Once more, in the words of the sweet psalmist of Israel, Psalm 31, verse 5, compare Acts chapter 7, verse 59, and 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23. But adding to them that title of trustful love, which through him is permitted to the use of all mankind. "Father," he said, "into thy hands I commend my spirit." Then with one more great effort he uttered the last cry, the one victorious word, "Tetelestai," it is finished. It may be that that great cry ruptured some of the vessels of his heart, for no sooner had it been uttered than he bowed his head upon his breast and yielded his life, a ransom for many, a willing sacrifice to his heavenly Father. Finished was his holy life. With his life, his struggle. With his struggle, his work. With his work, the redemption. With the redemption, the foundation of the new world. At that moment, the veil of the temple was rent in twain, from the top to the bottom. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 19, chapter 9, verse 3, and chapter 10, verses 19 and 20. An earthquake shook the earth and split the rocks, and as it rolled away from their places, the great stones which closed and covered the cavern sepulchres of the Jews, so it seemed to the imaginations of many to have disimprisoned the spirits of the dead, and to have filled the air with ghostly visitants, who, after Christ had risen, appeared to linger in the holy city. These circumstances of amazement, joined to all they had observed in the bearing of the crucified, cowed even the cruel and gay indifference of the Roman soldiers. On the centurion, who was in command of them, the whole scene had exercised a yet deeper influence. As he stood opposite to the cross and saw the Saviour die, he glorified God and exclaimed, "This man was in truth righteous. Nay more, this man was a Son of God." Even the multitude, utterly sobered from their furious excitement and frantic rage, began to be weighed down with a guilty consciousness that the scene which they had witnessed had in it something more awful than they could have conceived. And as they returned to Jerusalem, they wailed and beat upon their breasts. Well might they do so. This was the last drop in a full cup of wickedness. This was the beginning of the end of their city, and name, and race. And in truth, That scene was more awful than they, or even we, can know. The secular historian, be he ever so sceptical, cannot fail to see in it the central point of the world's history. Whether he be a believer in Christ or not, he cannot refuse to admit that this new religion grew from the smallest of all seeds to be a mighty tree, so that the birds of the air took refuge in its branches. That it was the little stone cut without hands, which dashed into pieces the colossal image of heathen greatness, and grew till it became a great mountain and filled the earth. Alike to the infidel and to the believer, the crucifixion is the boundary instant between ancient and modern days. Morally and physically, no less than spiritually, the faith of Christ was the Pelagianesia of the world. It came like the dawn of a new spring to nations effete with the drunkenness of crime. The struggle was long and hard, but from the hour when Christ died began the death knell to every satanic tyranny and every tolerated abomination. From that hour holiness became the universal ideal of all who name the name of Christ as their Lord, and the attainment of that ideal the common heritage of souls in which his Spirit dwells. The effects, then, of the work of Christ are even to the unbeliever indisputable and historical. It expelled cruelty, it curbed passion, it branded suicide, it punished and repressed an execrable infanticide, it drove the shameless impurities of heathendom into a congenial darkness. There was hardly a class whose wrongs it did not remedy. It rescued the gladiator, it freed the slave, it protected the captive, it nursed the sick, it sheltered the orphan, it elevated the woman, it shrouded as with a halo of sacred innocence the tender years of the child. In every region of life its ameliorating influence was felt. It changed pity from a vice into a virtue. It elevated poverty from a curse into a beatitude. It ennobled labour from a vulgarity into a dignity and a duty. It sanctified marriage from little more than a burdensome convention into little less than a blessed sacrament. It revealed for the first time the angelic beauty of a purity of which men had despaired, and of a meekness at which they had utterly scoffed. It created the very conception of charity, and broadened the limits of its obligation from the narrow circle of a neighbourhood to the widest horizons of the race. And while it thus evolved the idea of humanity as a common brotherhood, even where its tidings were not believed, all over the world, wherever its tidings were believed, it cleansed the life and elevated the soul of each individual man. And in all lands where it has moulded the characters of its true believers, it has created hearts so pure, and lives so peaceful, and homes so sweet, that it might seem as though those angels who had heralded its advent had also whispered to every depressed and despairing sufferer among the sons of men, "Though ye have lion among the pots, yet shall ye be as the wings of a dove, that is covered with silver wings, and her feathers like gold." Others, if they can and will, may see in such a work as this no divine providence. They may think it philosophical enlightenment to hold that Christianity and Christendom are adequately accounted for by the idle dreams of a noble self-deceiver, and the passionate hallucinations of a recovered demoniac. We persecute them not, we denounce them not, we judge them not, but we say that, unless all life be a hollow, there could have been no such miserable origin to the sole religion of the world, which holds the perfect balance between philosophy and popularity, between religion and morals, between meek submissiveness and the pride of freedom, between the ideal and the real, between the inward and the outward, between modest stillness and heroic energy, nay, between the tenderest conservatism and the boldest plans of worldwide reformation. The witness of history to Christ is a witness which has been given with irresistible cogency, and it has been so given to none but him. But while even the unbeliever must see what the life and death of Jesus have effected in the world, to the believer that life and death are something deeper still. To him they are nothing less than a resurrection from the dead. He sees in the cross of Christ something which far transcends its historical significance. He sees in it the fulfillment of all prophecy, as well as the consummation of all history. He sees in it the explanation of the mystery of birth and the conquest over the mystery of the grave. In that life he finds a perfect example, in that death an infinite redemption. As he contemplates the incarnation and the Crucifixion, he no longer feels that God is far away, and that this earth is but a disregarded speck in the infinite azure, and he himself but an insignificant atom chance thrown amid the 1,000,000,000 living souls of an innumerable race. But he exclaims in faith and hope and love, quote, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. Yea, he will be their God, and they shall be his people." End quote. Quote, "Ye are the temple of the living God. As God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them." End quote. Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 26. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 16. The sun was westering as the darkness rolled away from the completed sacrifice. They who had not thought it a pollution to inaugurate their feast by the murder of their Messiah were seriously alarmed lest the sanctity of the following day, which began at sunset, should be compromised by the hanging of the corpses on the cross. And, horrible to relate, the crucified often lived for many hours, nay, even for 2 days, in their torture. The Jews therefore begged Pilate that their legs might be broken and their bodies taken down. The Crucifixion, as it was called, consisted in striking the legs of the sufferers with a heavy mallet, a violence which seemed always to have hastened, if it did not instantly cause, their death. Nor would the Jews be the only persons who would be anxious to hasten the end by giving the deadly blow. Until life was extinct, the soldiers appointed to guard the execution dared not leave the ground. The wish, therefore, was readily granted. The soldiers broke the legs of the 2 malefactors first, and then, coming to Jesus, found that the great cry had been indeed his last, and that he was dead already. They did not therefore break his legs, and thus unwittingly preserved the symbolism of that paschal lamb, of which he was the antitype, and of which it had been commanded that, quote, "a bone of it shall not be broken." End quote. Exodus chapter 12, verse 46. St. John also refers to Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. Revelations chapter 1, verse 7. And yet, as he might be only in a syncope, as instances had been known in which men apparently dead had been taken down from the cross and resuscitated, and as the lives of the soldiers would have had to answer for any irregularity, one of them, in order to make death certain, drove the broad head of his hasta into his side. The wound, as it was meant to do, pierced the region of the heart, and forthwith, says St. John, with an emphatic appeal to the truthfulness of his eyewitness, an appeal which would be singularly and impossibly blasphemous if the narrative were the forgery which so much elaborate modern criticism has wholly failed to prove that it is. Quote, "Forthwith came there out blood and water." End quote. Whether the water was due to some abnormal pathological conditions caused by the dreadful complication of the Saviour's sufferings, or whether it rather means that the pericardium had been rent by the spear point, and that those who took down the body observed some drops of its serum mingled with the blood. In either case, the lance thrust was sufficient to hush all the heretical assertions that Jesus had only seemed to die. And as it assured the soldiers, so should it assure all who could have doubted, that he who on the 3rd day rose again had in truth been crucified, dead, and buried, and that his soul had passed into the unseen world. End of chapter 61. Chapter 62 of The Life of Christ by Frederic Farrar. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gillian Hendrie. Chapter 62. The Resurrection. Quote, "Necesse est pauca dicamus de Christo ut Deo." We must say a little of Christ as God. End quote. Tertullian, The Apology, 21. At the moment when Christ died, nothing could have seemed more abjectly weak, more pitifully hopeless, more absolutely doomed to scorn and extinction and despair, than the church which he had founded. It numbered but a handful of weak followers, of whom the boldest had denied his Lord with blasphemy, and the most devoted had forsaken him and fled. They were poor, they were ignorant, they were helpless. They could not claim a single synagogue or a single sword. If they spoke their own language, it bewrayed them by its mongrel dialect. If they spoke the current Greek, it was despised as a miserable patois. So feeble were they, and insignificant, that it would have looked like foolish partiality to prophesy for them the limited existence of a Galilean sect. How was it that these dull and ignorant men, with their cross of wood, triumphed over the deadly fascinations of sensual mythologies, conquered kings and their armies, and overcame the world? What was it that thus caused strength to be made perfect out of abject weakness? There is one and one only possible answer: the resurrection from the dead. And this vast revolution was due to the power of Christ's resurrection. Quote, "If we measure what seemed to be the hopeless ignominy of the catastrophe by which his work was ended, and the divine prerogatives which are claimed for him, not in spite of, but in consequence of, that suffering and shame, we shall feel the utter hopelessness of reconciling the fact and that triumphant deduction from it, without some intervening fact as certain as Christ's passion, and glorious enough to transfigure its sorrow." End quote. The sun was now on the edge of the horizon, and the Sabbath day was near. And that Sabbath day was a high day, a Sabbath of peculiar splendour and solemnity, because it was at once a Sabbath and a Passover. John chapter 19, verse 31, Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23, Leviticus chapter 23, verse 7. The Jews had taken every precaution to prevent the ceremonial pollution of a day so sacred, and were anxious that immediately after the death of the victims had been secured, their bodies should be taken from the cross. About the sepulture they did not trouble themselves, leaving it to the chance good offices of friends and relatives to huddle the malefactors into their nameless graves. The dead body of Jesus was left hanging till the last, because a person who could not easily be slighted had gone to obtain leave from Pilate to dispose of it as he wished. This was Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, of high character and blameless life, and a distinguished member of the Sanhedrin. Although timidity of disposition, or weakness of faith, had hitherto prevented him from openly declaring his belief in Jesus, yet he had abstained from sharing in the vote of the Sanhedrin, or countenancing their crime. And now sorrow and indignation inspired him with courage. Since it was too late to declare his sympathy for Jesus as a living prophet, he would at least give a sign of his devotion to him as the martyred victim of a wicked conspiracy. Flinging secrecy and caution to the winds, he no sooner saw that the cross on Golgotha now bore a lifeless burden, than he went to Pilate on the very evening of the crucifixion, and begged that the dead body might be given him. Although the Romans left their crucified slaves to be devoured by dogs and ravens, Pilate had no difficulty in sanctioning the more humane and reverent custom of the Jews, which required, even in extreme cases, the burial of the dead. He was, however, amazed at the speediness with which death had supervened, and sending for the centurion, asked whether it had taken place sufficiently long to distinguish it from a faint or swoon. On ascertaining that such was the fact, he at once assigned the body, doubtless with some real satisfaction, to the care of this honourable counsellor. Without wasting a moment, Joseph purchased a long piece of fine linen, and took the body from its cross. Meanwhile, the force of his example had helped to waken a kindred feeling in the soul of the candid but fearful Nicodemus. If, as seems extremely probable, he be identical with the Nakdeman Ben Gurion of the Talmud, he was a man of enormous wealth, and however much he had held back during the life of Jesus, now on the evening of his death, his heart was filled with a gush of compassion and remorse, and he hurried to the cross and burial with an offering of truly royal munificence. The faith which had once required the curtain of darkness can now venture at least into the light of sunset, and brightened finally into noonday confidence. Thanks to this glow of kindling sorrow and compassion in the hearts of these two noble and wealthy disciples, he who died as a malefactor was buried as a king. Quote, "He made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death." End quote. The fine linen, sindon, which Joseph had purchased, was richly spread with the 100 litras of myrrh and perfumed aloe wood which Nicodemus had brought, and the lacerated body, whose divinely human spirit was now in the calm of its Sabbath rest in the paradise of God, was thus carried to its loved and peaceful grave. Close by the place of crucifixion, if not an actual part of it, John chapter 19, verse 41, was a garden belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, and in its enclosure he had caused a new tomb to be hewn for himself out of the solid rock, that he might be buried in the near precincts of the Holy City. The tomb had never been used, but in spite of the awful sacredness which the Jews attached to their rock-hewn sepulchres, and the sensitive scrupulosity with which they shrank from all contact with a corpse, Joseph never hesitated to give up for the body of Jesus the last home which he had designed for his own use. But the preparations had to be hurried, because when the sun had set, the Sabbath would have begun. All that they could do, therefore, was to wash the corpse, to lay it amid the spices, to wrap the head in a white napkin, to roll the fine linen round and round the wounded limbs, and to lay the body reverently in the rocky niche. Then, with the united toil of several men, they rolled a golal, or great stone, to the horizontal aperture. And scarcely had they accomplished this, when, as the sun sank behind the hills of Jerusalem, the new Sabbath dawned. Luke chapter 23, verse 54. Mary of Magdala and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, had seated themselves in the garden to mark well the place of sepulture, and other Galilean women had also noticed the spot, and had hurried home to prepare fresh spices and ointments before the Sabbath began, that they might hasten back early on the morning of Sunday, and complete that embalming of the body which Joseph and Nicodemus had only hastily begun. They spent in quiet that miserable Sabbath, which, for the broken hearts of all who loved Jesus, was a Sabbath of anguish and despair. But the enemies of Christ were not so inactive. The awful misgiving of guilty consciences was not removed even by his death upon the cross. They recalled with dreadful reminiscence the rumoured prophecies of his resurrection, the sign of the prophet Jonah, which he had said would alone be given them. Matthew chapter 12, verse 39. The great utterance about the destroyed temple, which he would in 3 days raise up. And these intimations, which were but dim to a crushed and wavering faith, were read like fiery letters upon the wall by the illuminating glare of an uneasy guilt. Pretending therefore to be afraid lest his body should be stolen by his disciples for purposes of imposture, they begged that, until the 3rd day, the tomb might be securely guarded. Pilate gave them a brief and haughty permission to do anything they liked, for apparently in the evening, when the great Paschal Sabbath was over, they sent their guard to seal the golal and to watch the sepulchre. Night passed, and before the faint streak of dawn began to silver the darkness of that first great Easter day, the passionate love of those women who had lingered latest by the cross made them also the earliest at the tomb. Carrying with them their precious spices, but knowing nothing of the watch or seal, they anxiously inquired among themselves, as they groped their way with sad and timid steps through the glimmering darkness, who should roll away for them the great stone which closed the sepulchre. The 2 Marys were foremost of this little devoted band, and after them came Salome and Joanna. Mark chapter 16, verses 1 to 7, compared with John chapter 20, verse 1, Luke chapter 24, verses 1 to 10, Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 to 7. They found their difficulty solved for them. It became known then, or afterwards, that some dazzling angelic vision in white robes had terrified the keepers of the tomb, and had rolled the stone from the tomb amid the shocks of earthquake. And as they came to the tomb, there they too saw angels in white apparel, who bade them hasten back to the apostles, and tell them, and especially Peter, that Christ, according to his own word, had risen from the dead, and would go before them like a shepherd into their own beloved and native Galilee. They hurried back in a tumult of rapture and alarm, telling no one except the disciples, and even to the disciples their words sounded like an idle tale. But Mary of Magdala, who seems to have received a separate and special intimation, hastened at once to Peter and John. No sooner had they received this startling news than they rose to see with their own eyes what had happened. John outstripped in speed his elder companion, and arrived first, stooped down, and gazed in silent wonder into that open grave. The grave was empty, and the linen cerements were lying neatly folded, each in its proper place. Then Peter came up, and with his usual impetuosity, heedless of ceremonial pollution, and of every consideration but his love and his astonishment, plunged into the sepulchre. John followed him and saw and believed, and the 2 apostles took back the undoubted certainty to their wondering brethren. In spite of fear and anxiety and that dull intelligence which, by their own confession, was so slow to realize the truths they had been taught, there dawned upon them even then the trembling hope which was so rapidly to become the absolute conviction that Christ had risen indeed, that on that morning the grave of Christ was untenanted, that his body had not been removed by his enemies, that its absence caused to his disciples the profoundest amazement, not unmingled in the breasts of some of them with sorrow and alarm, that they subsequently became convinced by repeated proofs that he had indeed risen from the dead, that for the truth of this belief they were ready at all times themselves to die, that the belief effected a profound and total change in their character, making the timid courageous and the weak irresistible, that they were incapable of a conscious falsehood, and that, even if it had not been so, a conscious falsehood could never have had power to convince the disbelief and regenerate the morality of the world, that on this belief of the resurrection were built the still universal observance of the first day of the week, and the entire foundations of the Christian Church. These, at any rate, are facts which even scepticism itself, if it desires to be candid, can hardly fail, however reluctantly and slowly, to admit. But as yet no eye had seen him, and to Mary of Magdala, to her who loved most because she had been forgiven most, and out of whose soul, now ardent as flame and clear as crystal, he had cast 7 devils, was this glorious honour first vouchsafed. John chapter 20, verses 11 to 18. Even the vision of angels had not soothed the passion of agitation and alarm which she experienced when, returning once more to the tomb, she found that it was no longer possible for her to pay the last offices of devotion and tenderness to the crucified body of her Lord. From her impassioned soul, not even the white-robed visions and angel voices could expel the anguish which she experienced in the one haunting thought, "They have taken my Lord out of the sepulchre, and I know not where they have laid him." With her whole heart absorbed in this thought, she turned away, and lo, Jesus himself standing before her. It was Jesus, but not as she had known him. There was something spiritual, something not of earth, in that risen and glorified body. Some accident of dress or appearance made her fancy that it was the keeper of the garden, and in the eager hope that he can explain to her the secret of that empty and angel-haunted grave, she exclaims to him in an agony of appeal, turning her head aside as she addressed him, perhaps that she might hide her streaming tears. What, "Oh, sir, if you took him away, tell me where you put him, and I will take him." Jesus saith to her, "Mary." That one word, in those awful yet tender tones of voice, at once penetrated to her heart. Turning towards him, trying apparently to clasp his feet or the hem of his garment, she cried to him in her native Aramaic, "Rabboni, O my master," and then remained speechless with her transport. Jesus himself gently checked the passion of her enthusiasm. "Cling not to me," he exclaimed. John chapter 20, verse 17. "For not yet have I ascended to the Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and my God and your God." Awestruck, she hastened to obey. She repeated to them that solemn message, and through all future ages has thrilled that first utterance which made on the minds of those who heard it so indelible an impression. "I have seen the Lord." 2. Nor was her testimony unsupported. Jesus met the other women also, and said to them, "All hail." Terror mingled with their emotion as they clasped his feet. "Fear not," he said to them. "Go, bid my brethren that they depart into Galilee, and there shall they see me." Matthew chapter 28, verses 9 and 10. It was useless for the guards to stay beside an empty grave. With fear for the consequences, and horror at all that they had seen, they fled to the members of the Sanhedrin, who had given them their secret commission. To these hardened hearts, belief and investigation were alike out of the question. Their only refuge seemed to be in lies. They instantly tried to hush up the whole matter. They suggested to the soldiers that they must have slept, and that while they did so, the disciples had stolen the body of Jesus. Matthew chapter 28, verses 11 to 15. But such a tale was too infamous for credence, and too ridiculous for publicity. If it became known, nothing could have saved these soldiers, supposing them to have been Romans, from disgrace and execution. The Sadducees therefore bribed the men to consult their common interests by burying the whole matter in secrecy and silence. It was only gradually and later, and to the initiated, that the base calumny was spread. Within 6 weeks of the resurrection, that great event was the unshaken faith of every Christian. Within a few years of the event, the palpable historic proofs of it, and the numerous testimonies of its reality, strengthened by a memorable vision vouchsafed to himself, had won assent from the acute and noble intellect of a young Pharisaic zealot and persecutor, whose name was Saul. Romans chapter 6 verse 4, Ephesians chapter 1 verse 20, Galatians chapter 1 verse 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 4 to 8, and so on. But it was only in posthumous and subterranean whispers that the dark falsehood was disseminated, which was intended to counteract this overwhelming evidence. St. Matthew says that when he wrote his Gospel, it was still commonly bruited among the Jews. It continued to be received among them for centuries, and is one of the blaspheming follies repeated and amplified 12 centuries afterwards in the Toledot Yeshu. 3. The third appearance of Jesus was to Peter. The details of it are wholly unknown to us. Luke chapter 24 verse 34, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 5. They may have been of a nature too personal to have been revealed. The fact rests on the express testimony of St. Luke and St. Paul. 4. On the same day, the Lord's fourth appearance was accompanied with circumstances of the deepest interest. 2 of the disciples were on their way to a village named Emmaus, of uncertain site, but about 8 miles from Jerusalem, and were discoursing with sad and anxious hearts on the awful incidents of the last 2 days, when a stranger joined them, and asked them the cause of their clouded looks and anxious words. They stopped and looked at this unknown traveller with a dubious and unfriendly glance. Luke chapter 24 verses 13 to 35. And when one of the two, whose name was Cleopas, spoke in reply, there is a touch of surprise and suspicion in the answer which he ventured to give. Dost thou live alone, as a stranger in Jerusalem, and dost thou not know what things happened there in these last days? What things? He asked them. Then they told him how all their yearning hopes that Jesus had been the great prophet who should redeem his people had been dashed to the earth, and how all his mighty deeds before God and the people had ended 2 days back on the shameful cross. They described the feeling of amazement with which, on this the 3rd day, they had heard the women's rumours of angel visions, and the certain testimony of some of their brethren that the tomb was empty now. But, added the speaker with a sigh of incredulity and sorrow, but him they saw not. Then, reproaching them with the dullness of their intelligence and their affections, the stranger showed them how through all the Old Testament, from Moses onwards, there was one long prophecy of the sufferings, no less than of the glory, of Christ. In such high converse they drew near to Emmaus, and the stranger seemed to be going onwards, but they pressed him to stay, and as they sat down to their simple meal, and he blessed and brake the bread, suddenly their eyes were opened, and in spite of the altered form, Mark chapter 16 verse 12, they recognized that he who was with them was their Lord. But even as they recognized him, he was with them no longer. Did not our heart burn within us, they exclaimed to each other, while he was speaking with us in the way, while he was opening to us the Scriptures? Rising instantly, they returned to Jerusalem with the strange and joyous tidings. They found no dubious listeners now. They too were received with the rapturous affirmation, "The Lord is risen indeed, and hath appeared unto Simon." 5. Once more, for the 5th time on that eternally memorable Easter day, Jesus manifested himself to his disciples. 10 of them were sitting together, with doors closed for fear of the Jews. As they exchanged and discussed their happy intelligence, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them with the words, "Peace be with you." the unwanted aspect of that glorified body, the awful significance of the fact that he had risen from the dead, scared and frightened them. The presence of their Lord was indeed corporeal, but it was changed. They thought that it was a spirit which was standing before them. "Why are ye troubled?" he asked, "and why do anxious doubts rise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I. Handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones, as ye see me have." Even while he spoke, he showed them his hands and his side. And then, while joy, amazement, incredulity were all struggling in their hearts, he asked them if they had there anything to eat, and, yet further to assure them, ate a piece of broiled fish in their presence. Then once more he said, quote, "Peace be unto you. As my Father hath sent me, even so sent I you." Breathing on them, he said, "Receive ye the Holy Ghost. Whosesoever sins ye remit, they are remitted to them. Whosesoever sins ye retain, they are retained." 6. Only one of the apostles had been absent, Thomas the twin. His character, as we have seen already, was affectionate but melancholy. To him the news seemed too good to be true. In vain did the other disciples assure him, "We have seen the Lord." Happily for us, though less happily for him, he declared with strong asseveration that nothing would convince him, short of actually putting his own finger into the print of the nails, and his hands into his side. A week passed, and the faithfully recorded doubts of the anxious apostle remained unsatisfied. On the 8th day, or, as we should say, on the 7th day afterwards, for already the resurrection had made the first day of the week sacred to the hearts of the apostles, the 11 were again assembled within closed doors. Once more Jesus appeared to them, and after his usual gentle and solemn blessing, called Thomas and bade him stretch forth his finger and put it in the print of the nails, and to thrust his hand into the spear wound of his side, and to be not faithless, but believing. "My Lord and my God!" exclaimed the incredulous apostle, with a burst of conviction. "Because thou hast seen me," said Jesus, "thou hast believed. Blessed are they who saw not, and yet believed." 7. The next appearance of the risen Saviour was to 7 of the apostles by the Sea of Galilee: Simon, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others, not improbably Philip and Andrew, who are not named. John chapter 21, verses 1 to 24. A pause had occurred in the visits of Jesus, and before they returned to Jerusalem at Pentecost to receive the promised outpouring of the Spirit, Simon said that he should resume for the day his old trade of a fisherman. There was no longer a common purse, and as their means of subsistence were gone, this seemed to be the only obvious way of obtaining an honest maintenance. The others proposed to join him, and they set sail in the evening, because night is the best time for fishing. All night they toiled in vain. At early dawn, in the misty twilight, there stood on the shore the figure of one whom they did not recognize. A voice asked them if they had caught anything. "No," was the despondent answer. "Fling your net to the right side of the vessel, and ye shall find." They made the cast, and instantly were scarcely able to draw the net from the multitude of fishes. The incident awoke with overwhelming force the memory of earlier days. "It is the Lord," whispered John to Peter, and instantly the warm-hearted enthusiast, tightening his fisher's tunic round his loins, leaped into the sea to swim across the 100 yards which separated him from Jesus, and cast himself, all wet from the waves, before his feet. More slowly the others followed, dragging the strained but unbroken net with its 153 fishes. A wood fire was burning on the strand, some bread lay beside it, and some fish were being broiled on the glowing embers. It is a sight which may often be seen to this day by the shores of Galilee, and he who stood beside it bade them bring more fish of those which they had caught. Instantly Simon started up and helped with his strong arm to drag the net ashore, and he whom they all knew to be the Lord, but whose voice and aspect made their hearts so still with awful reverence that they dared not question him, bade them, "Come and breakfast." and distributed to them the bread and fish. The happy meal ended in silence, and then Jesus said to his weak but fond apostle, Simon, it was no time as yet to restore to him the name of Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, honourest thou me more than these? Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. Feed my little lambs. Simon had felt in his inmost heart what was meant by that kind rebuke, more than these. It called back to his penitent soul those boastful words, uttered so confidently among his brethren, quote, although all shall be offended, yet will not I. Failure had taught him humility, and therefore he will neither claim a preeminence in affection, nor adopt the word of the Saviour's question, agapas, which involved deep honour and devotion and esteem, but will substitute for it that weaker word, which yet best expressed the warm human affection of his heart. And the next time, the question reminded him less painfully of his old self-confidence, for Jesus said to him only, Simon, son of Jonas, honourest thou me? Again the apostle humbly answered in the same words as before, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. Tend my sheep. John chapter 21, verse 15. But Simon had thrice denied, and therefore it was fitting that he should thrice confess. Again, after a brief pause, came the question, and this time with the weaker but warmer word which the apostle himself had chosen. Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? And Simon, deeply humbled and distressed, exclaimed, Lord, thou knowest all things, thou seest that I love thee. Feed my beloved sheep. John chapter 21, verse 17. Then very solemnly he added, quote, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, when thou wast younger, thou didst gird thyself and walk where thou wouldst. But when thou art old, thou shalt stretch out thy hands, and another shall gird thee, and shall lead thee where thou willest not. The apostle understood him. He knew that this implied the years of his future service, the pangs of his future martyrdom. But now he was no longer Simon, but Peter. The heart of rock was in him. He was ready, even to the death, to obey the voice which said to him, Follow me. While the conversation had been taking place, he had been walking by the side of Jesus, a few steps in front of his comrades. Looking back, he saw John, his only favourite companion, and the disciple whom Jesus loved, slowly following them. Pointing to him, he asked, Lord, and what shall he do? The answer checked the spirit of idle curiosity. Quote, If I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Follow thou me. Peter dared ask no more, and the answer, which was intentionally vague, led to the wide misapprehension prevalent in the early church that John was not to die until Jesus came. The apostle quietly corrects the error by quoting the exact words of the risen Christ. The manner of his death we do not know, but we know that he outlived all his brother disciples, and that he survived that terrible overthrow of his nation, which, since it rendered impossible a strict obedience to the institutions of the Old Covenant, and opened throughout the world an unimpeded path for the establishment of the New Commandment and the kingdom not of earth, was, in a sense more true than any other event in human history, a second coming of the Lord. 8. It may have been on this occasion that Jesus told his disciples of the mountain in Galilee where he would meet all who knew and loved him for the last time. Whether it was Tabor or the mountain of Beatitudes, we do not know, but more than 500 of his disciples collected at the given time with the 11, and received from Jesus his last commands, to teach and baptize throughout all nations, and the last promise, that he would be with them always, even to the end of the world. Writing more than 20 years after this time, St. Paul gives us the remarkable testimony that the greater number of these eyewitnesses of the resurrection were yet alive, and that some only were fallen asleep. 9. A ninth appearance of Jesus is unrecorded in the Gospels, and is known to us from a single allusion in St. Paul alone. Quote, I delivered unto you, he writes to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8. That which also I received, how that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. After that he was seen of above 500 brethren at once. After that he was seen of James, then of all the apostles. And last of all he appeared to me also, as to the abortive born of the apostolic family." Respecting this appearance to James, we know nothing further, unless there be any basis of true tradition in the story preserved to us in the Gospel of the Hebrews. We are there told that James, the first bishop of Jerusalem, and the Lord's brother, had, after the Last Supper, taken a solemn vow that he would neither eat nor drink until he had seen Jesus risen from the dead. Early, therefore, after his resurrection, Jesus, after he had given the sin done to the servant of the priest, had a table with bread brought out, blessed the bread, and gave it to James, with the words, "Eat thy bread now, my brother, since the Son of Man has risen from the dead." 10. 40 days had now elapsed since the crucifixion. During those 40 days, 9 times had he been visibly present to human eyes, and had been touched by human hands. But his body had not been merely the human body, nor liable to merely human laws, nor had he lived during those days the life of men. The time had now come when his earthly presence should be taken away from them forever, until he returned in glory to judge the world. He met them in Jerusalem, and as he led them with him towards Bethany, Luke chapter 24, verse 50, he bade them wait in the holy city until they had received the promise of the Spirit. He checked their eager inquiry about the times and the seasons, and bade them be his witnesses in all the world. These last farewells must have been uttered in some of the wild, secluded upland country that surrounds the little village. And when they were over, he lifted up his hands and blessed them, and, even as he blessed them, was parted from them. And as he passed from before their yearning eyes, "a cloud received him out of their sight." Between us and his visible presence, between us and that glorified Redeemer who now sitteth at the right hand of God, that cloud still rolls. But the eye of faith can pierce it. The incense of true prayer can rise above it. Through it the dew of blessing can descend. And if he is gone away, yet he has given us, in his Holy Spirit, a nearer sense of his presence, a closer enfolding in the arms of his tenderness, than we could have enjoyed even if we had lived with him of old in the home of Nazareth, or sailed with him in the little boat over the crystal waters of Gennesaret. We may be as near to him at all times, and more than all when we kneel down to pray, as the beloved disciple was when he laid his head upon his breast. The word of God is very nigh us, even in our mouths and in our hearts. To ears that have been closed, his voice may seem indeed to sound no longer. The loud noises of war may shake the world. The eager calls of avarice and of pleasure may drown the gentle utterance which bids us "follow me." After 2000 years of Christianity, the incredulous murmurs of an impatient scepticism may make it scarcely possible for faith to repeat, without insult, the creed which has been the regeneration of the world. Aye, and sadder even than this, every now and then may be heard, even in Christian England, the insolence of some blaspheming tongue, which still scoffs at the Son of God as he lies in the agony of the garden, or breathes his last sigh upon the bitter tree. But the secret of the Lord is with them that fear him, and he will show him his covenant. To all who will listen, he still speaks. He promised to be with us always, even to the end of the world, and we have not found his promise fail. It was but for 33 short years of a lifetime that he lived on earth. It was but for 3 broken and troubled years that he preached the gospel of the kingdom. But forever, even until all the aeons have been closed, and the earth itself, with the heavens that now are, have passed away, shall every one of his true and faithful children find peace and hope and forgiveness in his name. And that name shall be called Emmanuel, which is, being interpreted, God with us. End of chapter 62. End of The Life of Christ by Frederic Farrar.